Late spring 1982, Guthrie County, Iowa. The air was thick with the smell of turned earth and diesel fuel, a wet, heavy blanket of a smell that clung to everything, a promise of corn yet to come. The fields were black and waiting. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue. It was a time of precision, a time of narrow margins, a time of calculation. Every seed was counted, every gallon of fuel was measured, every dollar was squeezed until the eagle screamed. This was the world of Elspeth Miller. She was 58 years old, a widow for 4 of them. Her hands were maps of the land she worked, creased with the memory of barbed wire, baling twine, and the cold steel of a wrench in January. She was a slight woman, made of wire and resolve, with eyes the color of a winter sky. She moved with a purpose that wasted no motion. She spoke with a thrift that wasted no words. The farm was hers now, 160 acres of rolling Iowa land, a small operation by the standards of the day. A tidy white farmhouse, a red barn with a roof that needed patching, a grain silo that stood like a sentinel against the horizon, and a flock. 40 Suffolk ewes, their black faces serene and foolish. One formidable Suffolk ram. This flock was her living. It was her husband Frank's legacy. It was her anchor in the shifting soil of the world. On a Tuesday in May, Elspeth Miller did something that made no sense. She climbed into her faded blue Ford F-150, the one with the dent in the driver's side door from a close call with a deer 5 years prior. The engine turned over with a familiar rattling cough. She drove east, out of Guthrie County, past the endless fields of newly planted corn and soybeans, past the mailboxes bearing the names of families who had farmed this land for 100 years. Names like Jensen, Richter, and O'Malley. She drove for an hour, the AM radio crackling with commodity prices and farm reports. She drove to the Adair County livestock auction. It was not a sheep sale day. It was not a cattle sale day. It was a miscellaneous day, a day for the odds and ends of the farming world. A day for goats, for chickens in crates, for old equipment, for animals that did not fit neatly into the profitable columns of a ledger. The men of Guthrie County expected her to come back with nothing. Or perhaps a few replacement ewes if a good deal presented itself. Or maybe a new part for the old John Deere tractor. Something practical, something sensible, something that would pencil out. She came back with a donkey. Not a fine breeding jack, not a strong working mule in the making, just a donkey. A standard donkey, a Jerusalem donkey they called him, for the dark, cross-shaped marking over his shoulders. He was gray, with a white muzzle and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything and judge nothing. He was neither young nor old. He was simply there, a creature of profound and stoic stillness.
She paid $150 for him. $150. In the spring of 1982, that was the price of 300 gallons of diesel. It was the price of a ton of feed. It was the price of a good replacement ewe, a pregnant one. It was a week's worth of groceries, and then some. It was a significant sum of money, spent on an animal with no discernible purpose. The transaction was simple. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained hat, barely paused. The donkey, Lot 74, was led into the ring. He stood there, unimpressed by the noise and the crowd. Elspeth raised her hand, a single decisive motion. No one bid against her. The gavel fell. A smattering of confused whispers followed. The auctioneer moved on to a pen of squealing pigs. Elspeth signed the bill of sale. She counted out the cash, the bills worn soft from use. She led the donkey to her truck. He followed with a quiet compliance that was almost unnerving.
He loaded into the stock trailer without a fuss. The drive home was silent, save for the rattle of the engine and the hum of the tires on the pavement. When she got back to the farm, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pasture. She backed the trailer up to the gate. She opened the latch. The donkey stepped out, blinked slowly, and surveyed his new home. The 40 Suffolk ewes
grazing peacefully, lifted their heads in unison. They stared. The donkey stared back. Then Elspeth Miller opened the pasture gate. She gave the donkey a gentle pat on the rump. He walked through. He walked into the field and stood among the sheep. And there he stayed. The word spread the way news always does in a small community. Not like a fire, but like water seeping into dry ground. Slowly, then all at once. It started with her nearest neighbor, Carl Jensen, who saw the strange silhouette in the pasture as he drove by on his tractor. He stopped, squinted, and shook his head. He mentioned it to his wife that evening. She mentioned it on the phone to her sister. By Wednesday, the story was at the co-op in Guthrie Center. The men stood around the counter, drinking bitter coffee from styrofoam cups. They wore seed corn hats and grease-stained jeans. They talked about the weather, the price of soybeans, the faulty bearing on a combine. And they talked about Elspeth Miller. They had one word for it: grief. It was the grief, they said. Frank's passing had finally caught up to her. A woman alone on a farm. It was too much. The loneliness must have settled in her bones. She bought a pet. $150 pet. A pasture ornament. They laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was a laugh of pity, a laugh of knowing condescension. They understood the world. The world was about profit and loss. It was about bushels per acre and pounds of gain. It was about efficiency. A donkey in a sheep pasture was the opposite of efficiency. It was a monument to waste, an absurdity standing knee-deep in clover. From the co-op, the story traveled to the town diner. It was served up with the Wednesday lunch special of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The waitress told the farmers in booth 3. The farmers told the implement dealer in booth 5. The implement dealer told the bank manager who came in for a slice of pie. The bank manager shook his head. He thought of the high interest rates, the tightening credit, the foreclosure notices he had to sign. He thought of Elspeth Miller's small, tidy operation. She was holding on, just barely. And now this. Throwing good money after bad feelings. A foolish, sentimental act in a world that had no room for sentiment. On Sunday, the story filled the quiet spaces in the church parking lot. It was whispered between hymns. The women, in their Sunday dresses, spoke of it in hushed tones. Poor Elspeth. She must be so lonely. A donkey for company. Can you imagine? They organized a casserole rotation, a gesture of sympathy for a woman who had clearly lost her bearings. The ridicule was gentle, but it was everywhere. It was in the pause before someone asked her how she was doing. It was in the quick, shared glances between neighbors when she drove past in her old blue truck. It was in the way the feed store clerk asked, "Just the usual sheep feed, Elspeth? Or do you need something for that new addition?" The logic of the community was simple. It was unassailable. First, there was the money. The $150 was just the start. The donkey had to eat. He would consume grass, hay, and grain, resources that could be used to support another ewe. And ewe would produce a lamb, maybe 2. And ewe would produce wool. And ewe was an asset. A donkey was a liability. He was a hole in the bucket. A drain on a farm that could not afford any leaks. The farm crisis of the 80s was not a distant headline. It was a wolf at the door of every farm in Guthrie County. Men were losing land their grandfathers had homesteaded. Every penny was a soldier in a war against foreclosure. Elspeth had just sent 150 of her soldiers on a pointless errand. Second, there was the practicality of it. What did a donkey do for sheep?
Nothing. They were not a natural pairing. A dog guarded sheep. A good border collie or a Great Pyrenees. That was a sensible investment. A dog could be trained. A dog would work for its keep. A donkey was stubborn. A donkey was unpredictable. What if it turned on the lambs? What if it kicked a ewe, breaking a leg? It was an unknown variable introduced into a carefully managed equation. It was a risk with no conceivable reward. Third and most powerful was the explanation of grief. It explained everything. Frank Miller had been the rock. He understood the land, the animals, the markets. Elspeth had been his partner, his helper. But now she was alone. The community saw a woman adrift. They saw a quiet desperation. The donkey was not a farm animal. It was a companion, a furry, long-eared symbol of her solitude. It was an act of a heart, not a head. And in the world of farming in 1982, decisions made with the heart were a luxury no one could afford. They were a path to ruin. Elspeth Miller heard the whispers. She saw the looks. She accepted the casseroles with a polite, quiet thank you. She did not explain. She did not defend her decision. She simply went about her work. She named the donkey Moses. She did not treat him like a pet. He was not brought into the barn for special treatment. He was not given apples or carrots from her hand. He was simply part of the pasture. He lived with the sheep. He ate with the sheep. He moved with the sheep. He became a fixture in the landscape, as permanent as the oak tree on the hill. The years passed. 1982 bled into 1983. The farm crisis deepened. A neighbor to the west sold his herd of dairy cows. The farm to the north went up for auction. Elspeth held on. She patched the barn roof herself, climbing the ladder with a sureness that belied her age. She repaired her own fences. She delivered her own lambs in the cold, wet nights of early spring. Moses the donkey was there through it all. He was a silent observer. He would stand on the highest point of the pasture, his long ears twitching, scanning the horizon. The sheep, at first wary of him, grew accustomed to his presence. They grazed around him, their quiet munching the only sound in the afternoon heat. The lambs, when they were born, treated him as a piece of mobile scenery. They would chase each other around his sturdy legs. He never moved. He never flinched. He simply stood his ground. The jokes about Elspeth's donkey slowly faded. The story grew old. It was replaced by new stories, new worries. The pity softened into a kind of resigned acceptance. It was just one of Elspeth's quirks. Like the way she still used old glass canning jars instead of plastic, or the way she kept a small, immaculate vegetable garden behind the house, just as her mother had. The donkey became just another part of the local scenery, a landmark. Turn left at the Miller place, someone might say. The one with the donkey in the pasture. 1984, 1985. The seasons turned. Corn grew tall and was harvested. Snow fell and melted. The sheep were shorn in the spring, their heavy fleece coming off in a single continuous blanket. The lambs were sold at market in the fall. Elspeth's flock remained healthy. Her finances remained stable, if not prosperous. She held on. Moses grew older. A touch of gray appeared on his muzzle. He moved with the same deliberate, unhurried pace. His presence was a constant, a point of stillness in a turning world. He would often stand guard at night, a dark shape under the vast, star-filled Iowa sky, while the sheep slept, clustered together for warmth and safety. He seemed to need less sleep than any other creature. He was always watching. 1986, 1987, 1988. The drought came in the summer of '88. The corn withered in the fields. The pastures turned brown and brittle. The creeks dried up. The air was filled with a fine dust that coated everything. Farmers sold off livestock they could no longer afford to feed. The heat was relentless. The sky was a pale, hazy white for weeks on end. The drought broke that winter with heavy snows, but the ecosystem was out of balance. The wild creatures were struggling. The deer were thinner, the rabbits were scarce, and the predators grew bolder. They were ghosts on the edge of the farmland. Coyotes. Their yipping cries carried on the night air, a sound that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They had always been there, in the wooded draws and along the riverbeds. But now, their hunger drove them out of the shadows. They grew audacious. Reports began to surface. A calf taken from a pasture near Panora. Chickens disappearing from a coop outside of Bagley. Then it was sheep. The smaller flocks, the ones kept by hobby farmers or on the fringes of larger operations, were hit first. A lamb found dead, its throat torn. 2 ewes missing, with only a drag trail and a few tufts of wool left behind. The men of Guthrie County grew concerned. They organized hunts. They drove their pickups slowly along the gravel roads at dusk, rifles resting on their dashboards. They invested in guard dogs, Great Pyrenees puppies that cost $500 apiece, a sensible and necessary expense. They warned each other to lock up their animals at night. The coyotes were running in packs now, they said, smart and ruthless. Elspeth Miller did not buy a guard dog. She did not join the hunts. She did not change her routine. Her 40 ewes and their new crop of spring lambs remained in the pasture at night, with Moses. Her neighbors worried for her. Carl Jensen stopped his truck by her fence one afternoon. "Elspeth," he said, leaning out the window, his face etched with genuine concern. "You ought to bring those sheep into the barn at night. The coyotes are getting bad, real bad. Took 3 of Richter's ewes last week." Elspeth looked at her flock, grazing peacefully. She looked at Moses, who stood on his small hill, his ears pointed toward the distant woods. She just nodded. "I'll be careful, Carl," she said. And that was all. He drove away, shaking his head. He told his wife that Elspeth was being stubborn, foolish. It was one thing to have a pet donkey. It was another to trust it with your livelihood against a pack of hungry coyotes. The summer of 1989 arrived. It was hot and dry again. The tension in the county ratcheted up. The coyote problem was now a crisis. Everyone had a story. Everyone had lost something, or knew someone who had. The night, once a time of peace and quiet, was now filled with a sense of menace. The yipping of the coyotes sounded closer, more frequent. It was the sound of a siege. One night in late July, a storm rolled in. Not a rainstorm, but a dry storm of wind and lightning. The sky flickered with silent, distant flashes. The wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse. It was a restless, agitated night. Elspeth woke several times, listening to the wind howling around the eaves. She thought of her flock, out in the open pasture. The next morning the wind was gone. The air was calm and strangely cool. Elspeth pulled on her boots and her work jacket and walked outside, a cup of coffee in her hand. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Usually the pasture was filled with the gentle bleating of the sheep. This morning there was nothing. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She walked toward the pasture gate. As she got closer, she saw it. The fence. The woven wire was torn, ripped from the wooden post as if a truck had hit it. A section of it was flattened to the ground. Her heart pounded in her chest. She scanned the pasture. It was empty. The sheep were gone. She ran. Through the gate, into the field. She saw the tracks in the damp earth. Dozens of them. The sharp, neat prints of canine paws. Too big for a fox, too small for a wolf. Coyotes. A whole pack of them. Their tracks were everywhere. They had come through the fence. A wave of silent, hungry predators. She followed the tracks, her eyes sweeping the pasture for any sign of her flock. For blood. For bodies. She expected to find a scene of carnage. A field littered with the dead and dying. Her entire livelihood wiped out in a single night of violence. The tracks led toward a small, wooded draw at the far end of the pasture. As she neared the trees, she heard a sound. A low bleat. Then another. She pushed through a thicket of wild plum trees and stopped dead. There they were. All of them. Her 40 ewes and their lambs. They were huddled together, backed into a tight corner of the pasture, protected on 2 sides by the dense woods. They were frightened, their eyes wide. But they were alive. They were all alive. Not a single one was missing. Not a single one was injured. And then she saw him. Moses. He was standing in front of them, a lone gray sentinel between the flock and the open field. His posture was different. He was not relaxed and stoic. He was alert, his head high, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. His body was tense, braced for a fight. His gray coat was matted with sweat and dirt. There was a long, bloody gash on his left hindquarter, another deeper cut on his neck. He was favoring his front right leg, a slight but noticeable limp. He had not run. He had not panicked. He had fought. Elspeth looked at the ground around him. The earth was torn up, scuffed and gouged from a desperate struggle. And in the midst of the churned-up dirt, there were two dark, still shapes. She stepped closer. They were coyotes. One was large, a male, his teeth still bared in a final, silent snarl. His neck was broken, twisted at an unnatural angle. The other was a smaller female, her ribs crushed. Moses had killed them both. He had stood his ground. He had faced the pack. He had used his powerful legs to kick, his strong teeth to bite. He had brayed, a terrifying, furious sound that could shatter the night, a sound that sheepdogs and coyotes alike fear on a primal level. He had been a demon of violence in the defense of his herd. He had driven the rest of the pack away. He had saved them all. Elspeth walked slowly toward him. He turned his head and looked at her. His dark eyes were calm. He let out a soft, breathy snort. He had done his job. She reached out and gently touched the wound on his neck. He flinched but did not pull away. In that moment, the 7 years of whispers, of laughter, of pity evaporated. The $150 was not the price of a pet. It was the price of a guardian. The most effective, courageous, and loyal guardian she could have ever found. It was not an act of grief. It was an act of profound and quiet wisdom. The story of that night spread through Guthrie County even faster than the story of the donkey's purchase 7 years earlier. Carl Jensen was the first to see it. He drove by that morning and saw the torn fence. He pulled into Elspeth's driveway, expecting the worst, ready to offer help and condolences. He found her in the pasture, tending to the donkey's wounds. He saw the 2 dead coyotes. He saw the unharmed flock. He stood in silence for a long time, his cap in his hands. He looked at the donkey. He looked at Elspeth. And he understood. He went to the co-op that morning. He told the men gathered there what he had seen. There was no laughter this time. There was only a quiet, stunned respect. The men who had called her foolish now called her shrewd. The women who had pitied her for being lonely now admired her for her foresight. The story was told and retold. At the diner, at the hardware store, in the church parking lot. The legend of Elspeth Miller's donkey was born. Other farmers came to her place. They came not to offer sympathy, but to ask questions. They looked at Moses, who was recovering quickly, his limp already fading. They looked at the flock of sheep, who grazed peacefully around their protector. They saw a system that worked, a system that made a different kind of sense. Not the sense of a ledger book, but the older, deeper sense of the land itself. Within a year, donkeys began appearing in pastures all over Guthrie County. Small, gray shapes standing guard over flocks of sheep and herds of goats, and even among newborn calves. They became a common sight, another tool in the farmer's arsenal against the constant threats of the wild. The price of a good donkey quadrupled. Elspeth never said, "I told you so." She never mentioned the years of ridicule. She simply continued her work. She cared for her farm, her flock, and her guardian. She had known something that the others had forgotten, a piece of old wisdom, passed down from a time when the world was not yet run by spreadsheets and diesel engines. The simple, ancient fact that a donkey will not abide a predator, that it will adopt a herd of sheep as its own, that it will defend them with a ferocity that no wolf or coyote can withstand. They said it was grief. They said it was foolishness. They said it was a waste of money. They were wrong. To understand why a 58-year-old widow in Guthrie County, Iowa, paid $150 for a lone Jerusalem donkey in the spring of 1982, you have to understand more than just the balance sheet of a modern farm. You have to understand the land. You have to understand the nature of the creatures that walk upon it. You have to understand the quiet wisdom passed down through generations, the knowledge that is not written in books, but is carried in the bones. Let me take you back, not just to 1982, but further. Let me show you what Elspeth Miller knew. Let me show you the history of the guardian donkey. The story doesn't begin in Iowa. It begins in the arid, rocky hills of the ancient world, in places where sheep and goats were not just a commodity, but the very essence of survival. The relationship between flock and guardian is as old as civilization itself. For millennia, the primary guardian was the dog,
the shepherd's companion, bred for intelligence, for herding, for a controlled aggression. But in many parts of the world, another guardian stood alongside the dog, or sometimes in its place, a quieter, more stoic protector, the donkey. The wild asses of Africa and the Middle East, the ancestors of the domestic donkey, lived in harsh environments. They were prey animals, but they were not helpless. They evolved to be tough, resilient, and fiercely territorial. They developed a natural, ingrained animosity towards canids, the wolves, the jackals, the wild dogs that were their primary predators. This was not a learned behavior. It was a genetic inheritance, a deep, burning hatred for anything that resembled a wolf. When humans domesticated the donkey some 6,000 years ago, they harnessed its strength for carrying burdens. But they also recognized this other, invaluable trait. A single donkey, raised with a flock of sheep or goats, would come to view that flock as its own herd, its family, and its protective instincts, honed over millions of years of evolution, would be directed toward defending that adopted family. This knowledge was carried across continents. It was folk wisdom passed from farmer to farmer. In the mountains of Greece, in the valleys of Italy, on the plains of Spain, shepherds knew that a donkey in the flock meant fewer losses to wolves. The practice was carried to the New World by colonists. In the rugged landscapes of South America, the burro became an essential protector of livestock. In the American West, prospectors and ranchers alike knew the value of a hardy donkey, not just for its back, but for its vigilance. But in the 20th century, especially in the industrialized heartland of America, this old wisdom began to fade. Farming became a science of inputs and outputs. Efficiency was king. The role of the guardian animal was professionalized.
Specialized breeds of dogs, like the Great Pyrenees and the Anatolian Shepherd, were bred and sold specifically for livestock protection. They were effective, but they were also expensive. They required training. They required special care. They were another line item in an increasingly complex budget. The humble donkey in this new world was seen as an anachronism, a relic of a bygone era, a beast of burden made obsolete by the internal combustion engine. Its role as a guardian was forgotten by all but a few. It was relegated to the status of a pet, a novelty, a creature for children's petting zoos. Elspeth Miller, however, remembered. She had not learned it from a book or an agricultural journal. She had learned it from her grandfather, a man who had farmed with horses and who held a deep well of knowledge that the modern world had deemed irrelevant. He had kept a jenny, a female donkey, with his small flock of sheep. He told Elspeth, when she was just a girl, that the donkey was the best insurance a man could have. A good dog is clever, he would say, but a donkey is just plain mean when it needs to be. A wolf won't cross a donkey twice. He told her stories, a story of a winter night when the jenny's furious braying alerted him to a pair of wolves testing his fence line. A story of finding a dead coyote in the pasture, stomped into the mud by the donkey's sharp hooves. These stories were filed away in Elspeth's memory, a piece of her inheritance more valuable than any parcel of land. When Frank was alive, they had relied on good fences and their own vigilance. Frank was a modern farmer. He believed in progress. He would have scoffed at the idea of buying a donkey for protection. He would have called it an old wives' tale. But after he was gone, and Elspeth was alone, the world felt different, more dangerous. The old stories, her grandfather's words, came back to her.
She didn't make the decision out of loneliness or grief. She made it out of a deep, pragmatic understanding of her situation. She was one woman against the wilderness that always nibbled at the edges of a farm. She could not be awake every hour of every night. She could not afford a $500 purebred dog and the time it would take to train it. But she could afford $150 for a piece of living history. A self-sufficient, low-maintenance, four-legged security system. Her purchase of Moses was an act of quiet defiance. A defiance of the modern consensus. A defiance of the neighbors who thought they knew better. It was an investment in a different kind of currency. The currency of ancestral knowledge. The community saw a foolish widow. What they failed to see was a shrewd strategist drawing on a deeper pool of wisdom than they could imagine. They saw a pasture ornament. They failed to see a soldier standing his post.
The science behind the donkey's effectiveness is fascinating. A donkey's eyesight is excellent, and its large ears can pivot almost 360 degrees, allowing it to detect threats from a great distance. When a predator is spotted, its first line of defense is a loud, intimidating bray. This alone is often enough to scare off a tentative coyote. If the threat persists, the donkey will move to offense. It will charge the predator, striking out with its front hooves. A donkey can kick with incredible speed and force, both forwards and backwards. It will also bite, using its powerful jaws and large teeth. A single well-placed kick can break a coyote's back or crush its skull. They are relentless fighters. Once engaged, they will not back down. They will fight to the death to protect their flock. This is what Moses did on that stormy July night in 1989. He was not just an animal, he was the living embodiment of thousands of years of survival instinct.
The coyotes that entered his pasture did not encounter a field of helpless prey. They encountered a territorial warrior. They were met with a fury they did not expect, and they paid the ultimate price for their miscalculation. The vindication of Elspeth Miller was more than just a personal victory. It was a rediscovery of a lost tool. Her story, which became a piece of local folklore, had a practical ripple effect across the region. The reintroduction of the guardian donkey into the agricultural landscape of the Midwest was a small but significant shift. It was a step back towards a more integrated, holistic form of farming, where the solutions to problems were sometimes found not in a chemical drum or a new machine, but in the simple, elegant logic of nature itself. Elspeth lived on that farm for another 15 years. Moses lived even longer. He grew old and gray, his steps becoming slower, his limp from the coyote fight returning in the cold of winter. But he never retired from his post. He stood his watch over the flock until the very end. The sheep were his family. The pasture was his kingdom. And no predator ever breached his defenses again. When Elspeth finally sold the farm and moved to a small house in town, she made sure the new owners understood the value of the old gray donkey in the pasture. He was not included in the sale of the livestock. He was a permanent resident, a legacy. He was part of the land itself. The story of Elspeth's folly, which became the story of Elspeth's wisdom, serves as a parable for a modern age. It is a reminder that the loudest voices are not always the wisest. It is a testament to the fact that new is not always better, and that progress sometimes means looking back to recover what has been lost. It is a story about courage, the courage to trust one's own judgment, even when the entire world is laughing. The courage to stand alone, guided by a quiet, inner conviction. And it is, above all, a story about a stubborn gray donkey named Moses, who, on a dark night in 1989, reminded an entire community that the oldest